So Napoleon launches his coup. It's popular, and then he decides he's going to uh, export his revolution. And so he goes east and west with his army, and he's finally defeated by the Brits and goes into exile in 1815. What his decline means is that the monarchy comes back. This was the status quo in Europe. This is what was working everywhere else. And so Louis the 18th at this point comes to power. He's then overthrown by Charles the 10th, etc. And then, bam, you've got a revolution in 1848. Now, given the recent negative and violent experience with revolution, why might we have expected to see the revolts of 1830, which led to a constitutional monarchy, and then 1848, which led to this democratic revolution again? So a couple of things to think about are ideational reasons and institutional reasons. So why don't you think about those, ideational and institutional reasons? From an ideational perspective, people had the taste of freedom. Once you have it, it's hard to give up. Recall the democratic experiences of Central Europe versus further east, where you had no traditions of democracy, which we talked about in the post-communism case. So in Central Europe, democracy came strong in 1989, and you've still got strong democracies throughout most of Central Europe. In the eastern cases of post-communist countries, you have a sort of a return to these non-democratic states because they never had traditions of democracy. From an institutional perspective, maybe these people were guided by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, for example. This could be ideational as well, but here you've got an institutional framework that lays this out for them. So whatever the case, in 1848, you've got a revolution which leads to the Second Republic. And this was all about universal suffrage and relief for the unemployed. And who should come to power but Napoleon's nephew? He's elected. And then he holds a plebiscite, and he becomes the emperor. And he rules until 1871, when Prussia wins the Franco-Prussian War. At that point, you've got anarchy, violence, and civil war. And this leads eventually to the Third Republic, which goes on from 1871 to 1944. During this time, you had a split between conservatives and fascists on the one hand, and socialists and communists on the other. And so with this split, what do you have? Well, you have weak and unstable governments. The one thing that you do have is a strong bureaucracy. So this Third Republic actually lasts really till 1940, when the Vichy government is installed. This is a puppet regime under the Nazis, and that's the picture that you see here on the left. The Nazis pushing the Vichy government along. And so this is the Third Republic. So nominally until 1944, but really as a puppet regime from 1940 to 1944. The Fourth Republic comes into existence in 1944 when de Gaulle, who led the French resistance to the Germans, eventually becomes prime minister. So this starts in 1944, and then after a decade of weak executives after World War II, de Gaulle insists on a new constitution. He wants significantly more power. And this is approved in a 1958 referendum, which creates the semi-presidential system, and this is the Fifth Republic today, that we have in France. So the Fifth Republic, the one that survives today, goes on from 1958 until today. Maya, can you sing somewhere else? No. Please? Okay, well, you got to sing quietly then. Sorry. He's in power for 10 years. He takes the French out of the NATO command structure. He establishes a nuclear arsenal. He creates a strong welfare state. He promotes European integration. Remember the coal and steel community. He nationalizes key industries. This is a very powerful leader and one who really sets the trajectory for France. But then finally, he resigns when the country is gripped by turmoil. In 1968, as we had a protest movement going on here, a peace movement, you had much the same thing, anti-industrialization, anti-nuclear in particular, protests going on in France. And de Gaulle issues a plebiscite with reforms, and his plebiscite fails. This is a time when you had the largest general strike ever of an advanced industrial democracy. You had 11 million workers who went on strike for 2 weeks. You had student occupations. They were anti-materialism, pro-left but anti-Stalin, and this is when de Gaulle goes away, steps off the political stage for the first time in a couple decades. So, one question you might ask is, was this French case of democratization more similar to the U.S. or the British one? This is a good comparative question to think about. In the U.S., and France, both had revolutions and written constitutions. In the British case, you're really talking about evolution. Lots of back and forth. But in the French case also, there was a revolution, but there was lots of this evolution, lots of this back and forth going on, just like in the British case. In the U.S. case, it was a much clearer path from A to Z. In the French case, it bounced around a lot, like in the UK case. So these three cases can teach us a couple things. Well, one big thing they teach us is that democracy can evolve over time and can take lots of different shapes. It can involve trial and error. It's context dependent. In the UK, you had a gradual evolution. In the US, you had a revolution and then an evolution towards greater participation. In France, you had a revolution, and then you had this sort of going back and forth between monarchy, democracy, strong-arm democracy, etc. Something to think about. Now we'll get into the institutions. And think a little bit about how this system differs from the American and British systems. And one big way is that here in the French system, you've got a law which is based on legal codes. The judges interpret the law with fairly little discretion, and they apply it. In the U.S. and the UK, we talked about this reliance on common law, the role of precedent. I probably didn't even mention this in the U.S. case. I mentioned it when we talked about the UK case, how it's similar in the U.S. But now you know even more. So there's the common law approach versus the legal code approach, which is how France does it, and much of the continent. Here in the system, in the French system, judges are much more active. They question witnesses. They determine whether or not charges can be brought in the first place. So that's an important distinction in the judiciary. In terms of the Constitutional Court, they have what they call a Constitutional Council, composed of 9 members, each of which serves 9-year terms. Now, 3 of these are appointed by the president, and 6 of them are appointed by the legislature. So it's a different system, and when you think about the forms of representation, that's important. So we've got direct elections for the president in the French case, and then direct elections also for the various districts in the parliament, but different, national versus local constituencies. So 3 by the president and 6 by the legislature. Members of the Constitutional Council can rule on the constitutionality of a bill after it's passed by Parliament, but before it becomes law. So this is important. After it's passed by Parliament, but before it's signed into law by the President. And it has to be given to them by the government or legislatures. They can't just pick and choose. They can only rule on the constitutionality of a bill if the government doesn't like it and gives it to them, or if the legislators don't like it and give it to them. Recently, since 2010, they've had a provision which allows for citizens to demand the review of a law for its constitutionality if this comes up in a trial. So this is sort of like our concrete review. So that's a recent change in the Constitutional Council. So a question might be, how does the Constitutional Council compare to our Supreme Court in terms of independence and strength? And when you think about this, what I want you to think about is who's on each one of these, how long do they serve for, who appoints them, what sort of powers do they have? So I'm not going to ruin that for you. Just think about that for a couple moments. In terms of the presidency, the president here in France is the head of state, not the head of government. But actually, constitutionally, is given relatively few formal powers, but in reality has lots of power. And this is power by precedent. De Gaulle went all out. So today, the French presidency is characterized by 5-year terms with no limits. There was a 7-year term before 2000, now it's 5-year terms. What the president does is the president appoints the prime minister. Then the lower house has to approve this prime minister. And then the prime minister does his or her own council of ministers, the cabinet. But usually the president does them too. So usually the president and the lower house are from the same party. And so the president appoints the prime minister, and this is approved by the lower house quite quickly. And then when this prime minister comes to create this council of ministers, the president gets involved in this too. So in reality, usually the prime minister is like an assistant to the president in this semi-presidential system. Though under periods of cohabitation, where the president and parliament are from different parties, the prime minister emerges from a different party and can have teeth. The president has to sign all laws. Okay, all acts of parliament has to be signed by the president to become law. And in fact, the cabinet ministers have to as well. The president can dissolve the legislature. The president can dismiss the prime minister. The president here is in charge of the armed forces. The president's in charge of the civil service. Although I've alluded to this, the civil service is actually quite high profile. They're highly skilled. It's a prestigious job. So these are bureaucrats that have significant powers as well. Although the president is in charge. Now, this is important. The president does not need parliamentary approval on finance bills and the annual budget. So, unlike in the U.S. case, there is no purse string constraint. Right? This is clearly a weakness of the legislature. On the other hand, the president in the French case doesn't have veto power, though he can call plebiscites and referendums. Which serve a little bit like a vote of no confidence vote in the public domain. Really what the president is doing is taking his or her reputation on the outcome, and they tend to resign if they lose. Or they can, I guess, fire the prime minister. The legislature, and now we'll talk about another semi-presidential system when we get to the case of Russia. So keep all these sorts of powers in mind, because we'll contrast it with Russia in the next couple classes. In terms of the legislature, we're talking about a 577-member National Assembly. People are elected to 5-year renewable terms. Often government controls the legislation and the agenda. So often the National Assembly doesn't do much. Although the National Assembly can also draft bills on its own, except with respect to spending. This is very important. It has no role with respect to spending. Although it can give the government permission to rule by decree if it wants to make itself irrelevant again, like the Estates General did way back when. Now, one of the key powers of the National Assembly is that they can call government ministers to testify before them. They can grill these government ministers. They can also amend legislation, and they increasingly propose legislation as well. In terms of the Senate, here we're talking about a 348-member Senate elected for 9-year terms. The senators are actually elected through an electoral college composed of the members of local government and members of the lower house. These are the guardians of local interest in the Senate. Their key power is really just delaying legislation. That's really what you need to remember. The Senate in France basically delays legislation, and that's about it. Very typical of a parliamentary state where the upper house is quite powerless. The key power that they have, besides delaying legislation, is the ability to reject constitutional amendments, because constitutional amendments need the approval of both houses. So those are the two key things. They can delay legislation, and they can reject constitutional amendments. And that's about it. You come to power through a majority SMD system. We talked about this when we talked about majority SMD systems. France did experiment with PR systems. The result was that they got some radical nationalists in power. And so they decided that less fair is really more democratic at the end of the day. So they adopted this majority SMD system instead of a plurality SMD system as sort of a compromise of sorts. So, for example, in the presidential elections, as you'll recall, when we talked about democracies, you have a 2-round election unless in the first round the president gets more than 50% of the vote, or the candidate, sorry. In the National Assembly, again, you have a two-round selection unless one candidate gets more than 50% of the vote. A party needs 12.5% of the vote to get into the second round. What this does is allows for other parties to exist, not just a two-party system, but it ultimately gives a winner-take-all outcome, requiring a very high threshold, this 12.5%. That's a very, very high threshold to get in. And this leads to real serious fights in the first round and then coalition building in the second round, where people rally around the closest candidate and the closest candidate to their interests in the second round. So again, this electoral system differs significantly compared to the US or UK systems. One question that you might ask is how does it strengthen or weaken the executive compared to the US or UK systems? So something to think about. In terms of the parties, let's take this on a separate slide.